Hello and welcome to this new video from Squeezed Lemon Studio. No review today, but a tutorial in which I will show you how to make an awesome nighttime city time-lapse. But first, let's take a look at the short clip I recently made with this technique. After that, I will be showing you how to make such a time-lapse with your own DSLR or other camera. It's really easy to do and the results can be great. You should note that I used two different types of time-lapses. A standard time-lapse that is relatively easy to create with a slight movement, and a so-called Dolly-zoom time-lapse that looks very cool but takes some more work than the standard time-lapse. An example of a Dolly-zoom time-lapse was the bit with the typical Dutch mill. I will explain both techniques in this video. Now let's take a look at how it was made. The first thing you need to have is a good plan. It sounds cliché, but think about what you want to show in your video, how long it should be and what material you need for that. When choosing subjects for a time-lapse, remember that it works best with movement in the frame from persons, cars, boats or anything else. Ideally you have moving light sources like the lights of passing cars. I chose to shoot in RAW as it gives you way more room in post-production to change colors and make the images more vivid. You can of course shoot JPEG to save space and time in post, but color correction will be limited. Now let's take a look at the normal time-lapse. Actually the workflow is pretty straightforward here. You set up your camera on a tripod and choose a good composition that works for you. Next you set all the settings at the right value. I opted for long exposure images with 2, 3 or 5 seconds per photo. Long exposures give you a sense of movement as passing headlights will turn into a white stream and people will be fake and blurred. Always go for manual exposure so the pictures will have the exact same exposure. You can choose your shutter speed first if you want to achieve that and adapt the aperture and ISO to make a good exposure. At nighttime you will probably choose to open the aperture and get as low an ISO as possible, especially if you don't opt for long exposures. However, you should consider that opening the aperture makes for a shallow depth of field. If you want everything from the back to the front to be sharp, closing the aperture a bit might be wise. And by getting a smaller aperture and a higher aperture number, like f11 for example, you will get point lights to look like stars. A nice touch to your time-lapse. Now that you have the right settings, it's time to start taking pictures. You want to play back your photos at a rate of 25 a second, or 12.5 for longer but less fluent images. So for 4 seconds of video you need to take 100 pictures. I used my Nikon D5200 where you can choose an interval setting in the menu. If you don't have this option in your camera, you might be able to download firmware to do so or think about another creative solution. With the D5200, you get to choose when to start the interval capture, how many pictures you want to take, how many time there should be between each picture, and whether you want to start it immediately or return to the menu. Of course, if you select a shutter speed of 5 seconds for example, the time between each picture should be higher. Otherwise, the camera will skip pictures. Now you just let the camera do the work without touching it. Depending on the shutter speed, this may mean that you will have to wait a minute or 10 or even more. But that's still less than you will need for the Dolly-zoom time-lapse that I will explain now. The difference between capturing the normal time-lapse and the Dolly-zoom one is that you move the camera between each picture and you adjust the zoom. That way you're moving towards the subject while zooming out. And that subject will most likely be a building. That's a big difference with the normal method. For the Dolly-zoom you should focus on a building or other static object as the main subject. And when choosing the path you will take, calculate that you will have to be able to move about 30 meters or 100 feet forward. Once you've chosen a subject and a path you will move along, set your camera on manual. Choose the right settings like mentioned before. But instead of letting the camera do the work, you will now have to take each picture yourself. Take a certain point on the building and mark that on your LCD or in the viewfinder with your autofocus box or area or guidelines. Whatever you choose or have on your camera, make sure that a certain point of the building appears on every photo in the same spot. You take the first picture with a certain amount of zoom. That also means that this technique only works with zoom lenses. For example, I made this one with my 18 to 105mm lens. But I took the first picture at 70mm. Now take the first picture. Wait until it's finished, then move forward about 1 feet or 30 centimeters. Make sure the camera is level, align the camera so the chosen part of the building is in the same spot in your composition, and zoom out a little bit. Your zoom should go from the starting value to the lowest value in 100 pictures, so it really should be a tiny little bit. Now take the next picture. You have to repeat this process about 100 times or more until you have fully zoomed out. Make sure that the chosen part of the building stays in the same spot and that the zooming out goes as smooth as possible. Divide it over 100 pictures. It will take some time, but when done right it will be worth it. I used these pieces of paper to divide the whole zoom range I would use into parts of 10 pictures, so I could keep on track with the amount of zoom. When you're finished with taking the pictures, it's time to move on to post-production. After you have imported all the pictures, make sure you put all the RAW files you want to use for each sequence in a separate folder. We will be processing the RAW files, but doing them one by one would take hours. That's why we will be using a special Photoshop feature. Open Photoshop and go to File, Scripts, Image Processor. Now you can select the folder where all your RAW files are. Next, click Open First Image to apply settings. Then select the folder where you want to place all the processed pictures. Select JPEG and fill in 12 so you get the highest quality. Now click Run. You can now apply the settings you want manually or choose a preset. Remember that this setting will be applied to all the RAW files. Once you're satisfied with the result, click Open Image and just sit back and enjoy. When it's done, you've got 100 or more processed pictures that should look quite nice on their own. Now let's make them into a video. Open Adobe Premiere or another editing program and choose the settings for your main sequence. My pictures are 24 megapixels, so you can make a 4K video. However, I chose to go with the 1080p main sequence and with 6000 pixels by 4000 pixels for other separate sequences. But I will get to that in a minute. Now import all the pictures. Go to Import and select all the files you want to import. Now select all of the pictures in your library. Click the right mouse button and go to the duration. Set the duration to 1 frame. Then it's time to make an extra sequence where you can place the files behind each other. This sequence should match the amount of megapixels that your pictures have. For a normal time-lapse, just place all the pictures after each other in the right order. In Premiere, you can simply select the first picture in the library, go to the last picture and shift-click. By dragging the pictures onto your timeline, the pictures will automatically be in the right order and every single one of them will be 1 frame. Now go back to your main sequence and drag the sequence you just made to your timeline. Because the other sequence was 24 megapixels, the images will be zoomed in quite a bit. Just scale the whole sequence down, but leave a bit of room so you can give the sequence a bit of zoom or pan or tilt. By giving the sequence a bit of zoom, pan or tilt, it will be less dull and static. Just take the first and the last frame and give them a keyframe and choose some nice values for a pan, zoom or a combination of both. Don't overdo it though, because otherwise it will look like shit. For the Dolly-zoom time-lapse you repeat the same process. However, for this sequence, you should choose the same settings as for your main sequence. Just import the pictures, make them all 1 frame long and just drag them to your timeline, which I have sped up a bit here. Place all the separate pictures, see how far you can zoom out without seeing the edges, and then select all the pictures and copy and paste the attributes. So the scale is the same for all of them. Now go to your main sequence and drag the sequence you just made onto your main timeline. This time you don't apply a zoom or tilt. You have already done a Dolly-zoom effect manually, but as you will notice it can be quite shaky and unstable. That's why you will need to apply the warp stabilizer. Apply that and your Dolly-zoom timelapse is done. Please take care with choosing the location for your Dolly-zoom timelapse. When you move in an open space, everything will be fine. However, as I can show you here, it can be quite ugly if you're close to a building while taking the pictures. If everything goes smoothly, you will now have 1 or more finished sequences for your timelapse. Just choose the right order on your main timeline, make sure the effects such as digital zoom or panning look good, and put some nice music on it all. That's how you create your own amazing nighttime city timelapse. And of course, the same can be applied to any other timelapse, like for example in daytime. Well, thank you very much for watching. We hope you liked it and found it useful. Please like if you did and please consider subscribing if you would like to see more tutorials, reviews and short films.